In this video, I'll be looking at the new dietary guidelines for Americans that were just released this past week. I will go through the guidelines to summarize and critically evaluate the key recommendations for you. I'll do this with my colleague, Dr. Ty Beal. Ty is a nutrition scientist working for GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and he also was a member of the scientific review group that helped the government put together these guidelines by summarizing the available scientific evidence. Before the guidelines were released, there had been a lot of talk by RFK Jr. and others associated with the Trump administration that suggested that major changes would be made in the new guidelines. Suggestions that seed oils rich in linoleic acid are poisonous, for example, or that saturated fatty acids had been unfairly demonized by prior dietary guidelines. So I invite you to join us to take a look at these new dietary recommendations, how these differ from prior guidelines, and whether these guidelines are based on the best scientific evidence. All right, thank you so much, Ty, for joining me.
It's great to be here, Mario.
So what we're going to do today for you, the viewer, is summarize the key points of the recently released dietary guidelines for Americans. What we thought we'd do is just share what the specific key recommendation is, and then each of us will chime in with some background information or some commentary. All right, so I pulled together some information from the key website, realfood.gov, and from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans document to make it easier for us to have this discussion. So the website starts with, pretty nice discussion just of the problem being that, Americans are sick. For example, 50% of Americans have prediabetes or diabetes, which is just an unbelievable number. 75% of adults report having at least one chronic condition. And 90% of US healthcare spending goes to treating chronic disease. And much of that is linked to diet and lifestyle. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you know this. I talk about this all the time. Cardiovascular disease like heart disease, stroke, diabetes, fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, different types of cancers. There are a lot of links to how we eat and how we live. And I certainly have been a great advocate for using diet and lifestyle for the prevention, but potentially also the reversal of many of these chronic diseases. So I'm very happy to see the government putting this front and center in these guidelines.
Yeah, me too. I really like that we can save money in the long term if we focus on how we eat and how we live our lifestyle. I think that's really critical, and it's not easy to just make all healthy food affordable, accessible, and everyone eat it. But I think it gives us some hope that it's not just about tweaking little things here and there. It's really about how do we dramatically change our diets and lifestyle so that we can save money overall in the long run.
Yeah, it's a win-win-win, right? So then they go into the old food pyramid. And that's a bit surprising because food pyramid really hasn't been in use for a number of years. And we'll see later why they chose to do that. But here's actually one statement I really disagreed with, where they say, for decades, we've been misled by guidance that prioritized highly processed food and are now facing rates of unprecedented chronic disease. The fact, this statement here that we've been misled, first of all, I think suggests that prior governments or prior generations of scientists have somehow acted in bad faith, which I think that's a strong statement, and I don't really see evidence for that. But particularly the statement here that, there's been guidance to prioritize highly processed foods. So I know pretty much all iterations of the dietary guidelines for Americans very well, and there's never been a prioritization of highly processed foods.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a bit extreme, and it's sort of mistaking cause and effect here. There is, I think, a clear omission of specifically calling out highly processed foods or ultra processed foods, and I think that has been an issue in past guidelines, as well as the recent report from the scientific committee, the previous committee. Now, I totally agree with you. Misled is extreme. That's not really the intent. I think when you look at previous guidelines, they do emphasize minimally processed whole foods, but they don't specifically call out the highly processed. And I think what I take away from this and sort of my view is that we obviously have been consuming 60 plus calories from these highly processed or ultra processed foods, and that needs to change. And so I do appreciate, at least in these new guidelines, that we're calling that out. But I take your point completely. It is an extreme statement.
Yeah, I think if they'd worded this differently, I'd be on board. This way, it makes it a little hard for me to jump on board.
Yeah. Yep.
So then it starts really bold letters, real foods, better health begins on your plate. And the new dietary guidelines for Americans defines real food as whole, nutrient dense, and naturally occurring, placing them back at the center of our diets. I think I personally, and you'll see this in many of my videos, I really also emphasize prioritization of whole and nutrient dense foods. So I'm happy to see that, but it's actually, I think it's sold here a little bit like we've just invented the wheel. And I don't think that's true either, right? It's, I think basically all prior versions of the dietary guidelines have also emphasized nutrient dense foods, whole foods, I think. So it's a bit hyperbole on that I do sense here in terms of how this is packaged.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of see this when this is communicated through the graphics. There's been a lot of stirring comments on the graphics, right? The language that's used in the marketing. Like we're still operating in a political world here. Like the U.S. is a huge bureaucracy, so I think that what we're seeing here is sort of a translation. Some things that are stated maybe exaggerated, some things that are not necessarily perfectly accurate. I totally get that, but I do appreciate the real food approach first, and then medicine sort of as a secondary option. Now, both are obviously important and a big part of health, but I really do like to see this sort of emphasis on real food.
Yeah. All right, and then they introduced what they called the new pyramid, and this is what it looks like. So maybe I'll call on you first for your first impressions. Like, what did you think when you saw this first time?
Okay, so let me just walk you through it. I saw this when they came out on Wednesday, and I had never seen it before. Okay, so I was involved in the scientific review group. I wrote two of the reviews. We did not get to have input in terms of this sort of graphics or the output. So when I looked at this, I was pretty impressed overall. Just the general theme of prioritizing protein and fiber, rich, unprocessed fruits and vegetables, minimally processed. So to me, this looked good. I didn't have any major issues with it at first. I think there's all sorts of nuance around how many plant proteins are there, what size are they, right? I've heard feedback on that side. I've heard comments about the placement of whole grains at the bottom. This is not like science here, right? This is trying to communicate the general overview, but it's not telling you necessarily the size of the food in the pyramid is the exact quantity that you should be eating. And so when you look at, like, if we get into serving sizes, there's still a recommendation of 2 to 4 servings of whole grains. So it's not saying don't have any whole grains. Now, I do think it's a huge improvement to not have the huge base of the pyramid just full of these grains, allowing half of them to be half refined grains. I think that was a big problem and a big upgrade in this one, right? I think there were 8 to 11 servings of grains in the previous guideline, and half of those could be refined grains. So that's a big, I think, improvement for our metabolic health here. I like to see the minimally processed animal source foods. I like to see the yogurt. There's an unsweetened yogurt. I like to see the egg, the nuts, seeds. You can see in there legumes, lots of vegetables. I like seeing the olive oil up top there. A lot of issues people have with the butter stick. I know that. We could talk about that later. But yeah, my general sense is this is, I think it's a useful tool. Now, there's plenty of criticisms, and I've heard a lot in the last 24 hours. But in general, my first impression, and I still kind of feel this, is that this is a big improvement from where we've been. How about you?
So I'd also start with the positive, and that is, for anyone who's watched any of my videos, coming from the point of view of someone who has studied clinically metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, obesity, and cancer, I have very often recommended that people build their meals around a solid serving of a protein-rich food and a solid serving of a fiber-rich plant food. And at first glance, I would immediately say, yeah, that fits the bill. And I think it's a good, there's a lot of benefit here in terms of meeting your micronutrient needs. If you combine these two, meeting your protein needs, meeting your fiber needs, lowering the impact, the glycemic index, the blood sugar impact of any carbohydrates you may be eating with these protein and fiber-rich foods. Really, there's a lot to like here. Now, there's two things that I would point out, and we can talk about them in a little bit more detail when we talk about the very specific detailed recommendations. But the number one is also that I think there should be a bit more obvious visual presence of plant protein sources, specifically things like, say, tofu or tempeh or beans or lentils, to replace maybe some of those very big pieces of meat up there. That would be my one big suggestion, just to make it a bit more clear that, protein can be provided in the form also of these plant sources. The other thing is that I see butter and oil, even healthy fats or oils, and we'll maybe talk about later what that may entail in the definition of these guidelines and how we see this. But personally, I don't think they fit up there. And I'm saying this because everything that's up in that top, 80% or so of this pyramid, in any combination could really make, in my mind, a pretty solid diet, right? I mean, you can combine maybe some fish with some eggs and a whole bunch of vegetables and make that your meals, and that's a pretty solid diet. Or you could have some dairy with some meat and also, again, some vegetables, and that's a pretty solid diet. And in varying proportions, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to actually implement your diet here. But personally, I think you always want to somewhat minimize the amounts of these isolated fats and oils you're consuming, simply because they're really mostly empty calories, right? I mean, they may have some essential fatty acids, but mostly they're just very calorie dense, very energy dense, but they have a very low micronutrient density. They don't come with fiber. They don't come with protein. So my personal view is I would have created a separate small kind of area for them on the very bottom of the pyramid and just said, pick some oil or fat for the preparation of your foods. Whatever you're choosing, pick that in moderation.
I can hear all the Mediterranean diet enthusiasts saying, "What about olive oil, Mario? Can't we put that towards the top?"
I'm actually all for olive oil, right? But let me give you an example. I mean, if you are, let's say you make some roasted broccoli, and even when I make roasted broccoli, I'll add some salt, some pepper, and I'll drizzle it in a little bit of olive oil. But if through an image like this, you're given the impression that the more the merrier, and you'll just drench it in olive oil, suddenly it becomes a very energy dense type of broccoli. And I'm not sure, it's probably still a fine meal and a fine dish, but I would personally prefer in a country where, about 70% of people are struggling with overweight or obesity, that we are a little bit more aware of the fact that these are very calorically dense ingredients, and that if we add them to anything, the energy density of those foods will increase. And science tells us fairly clearly that when the energy density increases, our overall ad libitum calorie intake will increase. And I see a lot of potential ifs and buts here. I can hear low carbers say, well, I can eat steak with huge stick of butter and I'm not gaining weight. I'm actually losing weight. Yeah, there are certain situations where you can do that. But for the average person who, eats their normal meals, if they just add, slices of butter or few tablespoons of olive oil to everything, I suspect it's going to be harder for them to lose weight and they may gain weight. That's my point of view. Well, how do you feel about that?
I agree with you for the vast majority of the population, right? I think the whole satiety per calorie approach is generally pretty spot on for most Americans. The only exception I would say is for the low carb group that you're talking about. And I'm not particularly low carb, I'm about moderate carb. But for the people who are low carb, you really do need, and if you're trying to go keto, you need a fair amount of fat. You don't want to go too high in protein. So I think for those diets, which again are probably a very small minority of the US population, that makes sense to have quite a bit more of, let's say, the olive oil, right? But otherwise, I agree with you. To me, the sort of added fats and oils category, it should never be a huge focus in any diet where you're trying to optimize health and in particular the metabolic health and the body fatness that we have in the US. So I agree with you in general.
All right, shall we move on? Take a look at some of the very specific recommendations. So this is now from the PDF file. That's, I think, just 8 or 10 pages. It's titled, Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And it's very, I think, clearly made for consumers directly. And it basically gives these high-level kind of recommendations. And the first one is eat the right amount for you. Right? It says here the calories you need depend on your age, sex, height, weight, and level of physical activity. Pay attention to portion sizes, particularly for fruits and beverages higher in calories. And then it also goes into the need for hydration and emphasizes non-caloric beverages and water, of course, here. What were your thoughts here about this one?
Yeah, I think it's good. Pretty solid. We could probably spend more time on some of the other
I think so.
Other topics a bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, my viewers of the channel know that, portion sizes is obviously fine if you eat like a dessert or things that are calorically very dense and that are, you may overeat. I think that makes a lot of sense. Other than that, I'm not a huge fan of counting calories and rather suggest people focus on diet quality so that they automatically eat fewer calories, right? But
if I was in charge of drafting these, I would have probably added a bullet about satiety, like eat satiating foods. I think there is something about eat the right amount. Like you're saying, if your diet is obviously if it's ultra processed, which goes against the recommendations, but if a typical American is going to eat, it's not really about willpower that much, right? I mean, that's part of it, but a lot of it really is about choosing the right foods. And for that, it's not just like you can just suddenly eat the right amount of the unhealthy foods, right? So I would probably add something around eat satiating foods. But
I agree. All right. So then there's a big section here that suggests to prioritize protein foods at every meal, specifically high quality, nutrient dense protein foods as part of a healthy dietary pattern. Consume a variety of protein foods from animal sources, including eggs, poultry, seafood, and red meat, as well as a variety of plant sourced protein foods, including beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds, and soy. So here, I think this looks like they're weighed equally, right? Animal protein foods and plant protein foods, and a little bit of a contrast to that pyramid. Also specifically recommends to not deep fry the foods, and then consume meat with no or limited added sugars, refined carbohydrates, or starches, or chemical additives. If preferred, flavor with salt, spices, and herbs. And it specifically recommends 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And that's a notable deviation from previous guidelines. And so how did you feel about this?
This is one of the most controversial points is the amount of protein, right? It's 50 to 100% higher than the current recommendations, which are really set at the EAR, the estimated average requirement. I personally think this is a very reasonable target if we're aiming for optimal amounts of protein. I think the average intake already is around 1.1 or so, or 1.2. So it's pretty close there on average. I don't have a big problem with this, but I do recognize that a lot of people do. One other minor point is that on the cooking, I generally agree with the swap deep fried cooking methods, but if you're cooking meat, for example, when you grill and you char it, you cook it at high temperatures, that's where you do introduce carcinogens. So I think there are lower temperature cooking methods or, steaming, boiling, right? There are other ways to cook things a bit in a way that's a little bit healthier. But that's just kind of picking it apart a little bit. In general, I agree with all of this.
Yeah, same actually. I felt also broiled or grilled should have been also discouraged a little bit. I know that's maybe the preferred versions of how people eat meat specifically.
Tastes better, right?
Yeah, but it's carcinogens, and also advanced glycation end product formation actually is pretty substantially increased. And research on this, I think, is, not fully conclusive in terms of the health effects, but they're definitely not a good thing if we overeat them, I'd say. So
yeah, fully agree.
I'll cover this at some point. But so in terms of the overall protein goal, I actually also don't have too much of a problem with it. I'm not sure I would have put it where they put it, but I have also shared on the channel that I think for people to, prevent overeating, having a solid serving of protein in each meal can be really helpful to make the meals more satiating per calorie. And simply because that's one of the big issues that we face on a population level. I do think that should be a big consideration, right?
Yeah.
So,
and another point I heard on this protein, which I think is valid, is from Stuart Phillips and others who say, if you're getting towards that 1.6 grams, like, you also need to be doing resistance training. You need to be that needs to be a part of this. And so I think implicit in these assumptions is not to say, eat this much protein and sit on the couch all day. It really, it should go with a lifestyle of let's be active, let's do resistance training. And in that context, I think that the protein goals makes more sense,
Yeah, I'm really hoping we'll get to that point as well, that on the population level, we realize more that regular resistance training is really not optional for adults.
One other point, Mario, is I've heard this sort of comment that what this is going to do is you're going to see, and I already see this, but you see a flood of just high protein processed products on the market. And so I don't think the guidelines are trying to say, eat protein bars and just add protein powder, right? Like, it doesn't say that in here, but I could see I could see the food industry and the population maybe doing some of that, right? Like an unintended consequence. So I think the emphasis here really is on minimally processed whole foods, and you will see that throughout the not just the guidelines, but in the graphics as well, right? They're not highlighting like a protein bar or protein powder. Yeah,
I know people are super interested in this. Maybe we could each both share a little bit of our take on this. So, I mean, what's your take on these fortified foods, protein shakes, protein bars, protein enrichment in everything? Like, what's your take on this as compared to, say, meeting this protein goal by including a lot of beans and legumes and tofu and some meat and some eggs and some Greek yogurt? Like, where do you see the key difference in those two approaches?
I certainly think it's good to prioritize the minimally processed whole food sources. So, as the eat real food sources of protein. Now, with that said, if you're going to eat these highly processed products, I think having highly processed protein is still lesser bad than highly processed refined starches and fats combined. So in general, I think if we're enriching some of these products that are pretty processed and really low in protein with protein, that's probably generally not a bad thing. Now, I don't think most people need any sort of supplemental protein. I don't think it's that important. If you're an athlete and you're a competitive athlete, obviously, if you're a bodybuilder, if you're really trying to maximize, I can see adding a protein powder, right? Like a really minimally processed protein powder, plant or animal sourced. And if you're on the go, I think the protein bars can be a nice way for some people, right? Because it's hard to get a lot of protein when you're traveling. So that's my general take. How about you?
Yeah, exactly the same. I would have actually thought you'd expand on this a little bit in that, the protein, like the whole food sources of protein, whether they be animal or plant-based, they have added benefits. And specifically, they're usually very rich in a variety of micronutrients, right? And so you're basically consuming the protein in a package that offers these other benefits. In the case of plant proteins, also usually quite a bit of fiber.
Yeah, and you'll see in there the term nutrient-dense protein foods. That is pretty key. It's exactly what you're saying. There's so many other nutrients, not to mention the metabolites. Like there's thousands of compounds in foods that can play beneficial roles, right? There even from animal sources like creatine, anserine, taurine. So I think that that's kind of implicit in this statement here. But I do think that these could be misinterpreted if you just said, "Oh, it's just about protein. I just need to hit my protein targets. I'm going to have protein powder, isolated protein shakes all the time." So, yep.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to the next one. So here, that's this one. They had a separate little rubric: consume dairy. Any thoughts there?
Well, I think I want to start by saying that when you look at diets around the world, they vary quite a bit in terms of how they get their calcium, right? And so in many contexts, like in many African countries, virtually no one consumes dairy products, right? But there can be small whole fish that provide calcium. There can be dark leafy greens, and so there are many ways that people get calcium. Now in the U.S., for better or for worse, we all know about the Got Milk campaign. There's been a lot of influence, I think, to make dairy a very big staple. So it is a staple. It is, if you look at it, it's a primary way we get calcium. It's obviously very bioavailable, right? So I in general, I think this makes a lot of sense for people who tolerate dairy well, right? And I think the good thing about that, I don't have whole milk. I don't have milk ever. I'm lactose intolerant. I don't have soft cheese, for example, but I do have yogurt. I can have yogurt, and I actually eat that every morning, and I don't have any problems. So I have Greek yogurt. I can have a little bit of hard cheese. So I think that this, in general, is a good thing here. Now, I don't think everybody needs 3 servings a day. I think that's definitely up to how you sort of construct your diet. But when you look at trying to meet calcium needs of about a gram of calcium per day, it's really hard to do that in the US diet without consuming a decent amount of dairy or having some sort of added calcium. And from the evidence that I've looked at, you don't really want to have a lot of supplemental calcium unless it's like a whole bone meal, because it can have some detrimental effects. So it's best to try to get through whole foods. Now, if you're a vegan, of course, then I think you certainly want to have, with your plant-based milk, for example, have a calcium fortified plant-based milk. Eat a lot of calcium-rich dark leafy greens, especially if they're low in oxalates, right? Which spinach can be high in oxalates. So general sense is this is fine. You've done a lot of work on the full fat versus fat-free. I don't think fat-free unsweetened dairy is a problem. So I have nothing against low fat, but I also think that full fat dairy is just fine, but based on the evidence. So to me, the consumer should be able to decide whether they want to go lower fat dairy and higher fat. I just would not do the ultra processed, fat-free, full of starch and sugars yogurt, right? Like that would not be as good. How about you?
Mm-hmm. And maybe let's quickly talk about this emphasis of full fat dairy here. So I've done quite a bit of work, including a dietary randomized controlled trial, and also 3, I think, systematic reviews on the topic. So it's actually pretty interesting that prior versions of the dietary guidelines have always recommended non-fat or low-fat dairy products. And in my view, that really was never well supported by the evidence, because the suspicion or the hypothesis would be that if you consume full-fat dairy products, that because of the fat, those dairy foods would be higher in energy density and make it more likely for people to overeat and gain weight. And we should see that in the population, that people who eat the most dairy foods, full-fat dairy foods, would weigh more than people who eat more non-fat dairy foods. Mm-hmm. That's really not the case. And we would expect that people who consume a lot of full-fat dairy foods have a higher risk of having high LDL cholesterol levels because of the higher saturated fat content of dairy foods. And as a result, higher risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, such as heart attacks or strokes. And that was also never clearly seen. There's a lot more to say about this topic specifically, but I'd say to give people the freedom to pick whatever dairy food they like, including full-fat dairy foods, is, in my view, pretty consistent with the evidence that suggests that full fat is just as good as non-fat or low-fat.
I think what I really am excited to see is the no added sugars, and I hope that this translates into school meals, because my daughters are both in public schools. They have school meals, and they're presented with chocolate milk or regular milk, right? And which kid is going to choose regular milk over chocolate milk? No one's going to do that. So I think that this is a big win for kids. to be able to have this. Of course, they're not going to feel like that when their chocolate milk is removed, but I think they'll get over it pretty quickly and adjust to the new norm.
I agree. All right, shall we move on? All right, then we have eat vegetables and fruits throughout the day. Eat a variety of colorful, nutrient-dense vegetables and fruits. Eat whole vegetables and fruits in the original form. Wash thoroughly prior to eating raw or cooking. Frozen, dried, or canned vegetables or fruits with no or very limited added sugars can also be good options. If preferred, flavor with salt, spices, and herbs. 100% fruit or vegetable juice should be consumed in limited portions or diluted with water. And vegetables and fruits serving goals for a 2,000 calorie dietary pattern would be something like 3 servings of vegetables and 2 servings of fruit. Your thoughts?
Generally good. I may like to see just a little bit more, but in general, I think that this is the right approach. I like that it's, again, talking about fresh. I don't think this varies that much from previous guidelines. I like that it's recommending not to consume the juices in high proportions or diluting with water. I think fruit juices can have gotten sort of like a health halo because they're made with fruit, but they, like you said, like you sort of have said before, these are just sort of very concentrated sources of sugars and no fiber to slow them down. So they're very, very fast, quickly absorbed in the body. So I don't really have a lot to say other than that. I think it's in general, pretty standard and pretty basic approach. I think this would probably align with the 400, consuming at least 400 grams of fruits and vegetables per day that the World Health Organization suggests. So how about you? What did you think?
No, I've not much to say about it, actually. I think, I'm always in favor of recommending more vegetables specifically. So people who really prioritize vegetables, ideally with every meal, or fruits, right? So let's say for breakfast, you have something that vegetables don't fit well with, fine, have some fruits with that, maybe some nuts or seeds, depending on what you have there. But if you can incorporate vegetables with every meal, really, and don't feel like 3 servings a day is the limit, right? The upper limit. It's certainly fine to have 4, 5, or 6. Yeah, but otherwise, I think I'm totally fine with these recommendations. Okay. Now, incorporate healthy fats. I can already tell you I will have a little bit of a different opinion here. Here, they recommend healthy fats are plentiful in many whole foods, such as meats, poultry, eggs, omega-3 rich seafood, nuts, seeds, full-fat dairy, olives, and avocados. When cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids, such as olive oil. Other options can include butter or beef tallow. And in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of total daily calories. Significantly limiting highly processed foods will help meet this goal. And then more high-quality research is needed to determine which types of dietary fats best support long-term health.
Yeah. This is another controversial area. I think the way that I would have done this is to put a little bit of a hierarchy on certain fats. So, for example, I would have emphasized, I like that it says many whole foods. So whole foods. I do agree with that in general, because that gets us away from the added fats and oils, right? But in general, whole foods is good. I would emphasize like omega-3 rich seafood, nuts and seeds, avocados, right? So some of those fats that have demonstratively been shown to improve cardiovascular health, right? Overall health. I would have had an emphasis there. I do like it that it says prioritize oils with essential fatty acids, and it specifically lists olive oil. Now, of course, olive oil is not very high in essential fatty acids. You hear a lot of people pointing that out. But again, olive oil, not very controversial. I would say out of all the oils out there, olive oil is probably the least controversial. When you look across the world, most nutritionists would say olive oil is one of the better added fats, right? Now, the other options can include butter or beef tallow. Who's going to eat beef tallow? Very few people. Butter, I think in general, I don't think butter or tallow are as healthy as olive oil, right? I think there's other. I don't think they're as healthy as this obviously as the seafood, as the full nuts and seeds, as avocados. But I do at least I think that there should be some allowance for some butter for flavor. I would not emphasize it. It does not need to be consumed. It's not contributing to health, and there are healthier options out there. Now, on the saturated fat, I have seen so much commentary on this being sort of conflicting, because you have all these recommendations for whole sources of animal foods, right? Like meat, you have dairy products. And how are you supposed to stay within that recommendation when you look at the added fat goal? Added fat serving sizes, it says 4.5 for a 2,000 calorie diet. It says 4.5 teaspoons of butter, right, or olive oil. Now, how do you do that if you're eating 3 servings of whole yogurt or milk products or cheese? If you're having fatty cuts of meat, you don't. But I think the point is that there are ways to do it. It's up to the person, right? So there is some flexibility of, do I consume more whole food sources of my fats? So in meats, poultry, eggs, dairy, seafood, nuts and seeds, etc., you will get a fair amount of saturated fat, and you have less room for adding more saturated fats like butter or tallow. You would have to work a little bit more with unsaturated fats at that point, or not add a lot of fats. On the other hand, if you're doing a diet that's either lean meats or just really lower, like a vegan diet or even a vegetarian diet or low fat dairy, you have more opportunity to add added fats that have saturated fat. So to me, it's not contradictory. I do understand people's critique of it, but I don't think it's so contradictory that you can't make sense of it. Like, there are ways to do it, and it's up to, now, how do you go about doing that based on the upside down pyramid? That could be confusing, right? You see a big stick of butter, and you see the big ribeye, and you see the full fat dairy, milk, and yogurt. You're going to be really pushing that 10% limit pretty quickly there, right? If you're eating all of those foods in high quantities.
Yeah. But I think they missed a bit of an opportunity, is my impression. And that is that, specifically with regard to saturated fats, I think it could have been emphasized a lot more that our understanding of how saturated fats affect atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk has changed quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've learned specifically is that, like about 30 years or so ago, we did all these randomized control trials where we compared, say, eating a lot of butter or palm oil, fats rich in saturated fats, and we compared them, say, to canola oil or soybean oil in large groups of people who consumed these for, say, 2, 3, 4 months. And then we looked at the LDL cholesterol and the ApoB, and we found consistently that with the isolated fats that are high in saturated fats, ApoB and LDL cholesterol tend to be higher. And it was assumed this would translate to an increased risk of ASCVD. But we've since learned that the same doesn't actually equally translate to whole foods rich in saturated fats. So, for example, if you consume 50 grams of dairy fat, either as butter or as cheese, you're going to have a lot higher LDL cholesterol and ApoB if you eat the butter than if you eat the cheese, even though the amount of dairy fat and saturated fat you eat are the same. And this has since been well recognized. And so, in other words, the way I see it is, I think you could give people more leeway on eating animal fats and fats rich in saturated fats as long as they come in whole foods, simply because, first of all, the negative impacts of the saturated fats on the serum lipid profile are probably less pronounced if they come in the whole food form. Mm-hmm. And in this case, at least, you're going to be also rewarded with additional benefits, right, in the form of protein, in the form of other micronutrients. None of which is the case if you encourage people to eat more butter and tallow, for example. So I agree with you. They should have much more clearly had tiers here and say, get your fats mostly from omega-3 fatty acid-rich fish and seafood, nuts and seeds, right? Whole nuts and seeds, olives, avocados, right? And that's fine. Then the tier below this would be, if you consume saturated fats, consume them in the form of whole foods, like meat, like eggs, like poultry, like dairy, full fat dairy or lower fat dairy. And then last, really try to just consume small amounts and just to, as you need it for cooking, of other types of fats, including potentially, if for higher heat cooking, there can be a use for these fats that are rich in saturated fats. Like I cook sometimes with ghee, which is clarified butter fat, right? I sometimes cook with coconut oil, but I don't use large quantities of them. Like I buy a small jar and we use it over 2-3 months as a family.
Could be also with the avocado oil, right? Like the high heat oil that's good for cooking.
Exactly. And I think that could have been pointed out a little bit more here.
Yeah, I agree with you on all of this. I think the in general, you do see an emphasis on whole food sources of fats, which I think aligns with what you're saying, but it's not explicitly saying to necessarily prioritize those over the added fats. So I can see a lot of ways that this could have been tweaked to sort of make that message clear and sort of have a moderate intake of the added saturated fats, which, the food matrix plays a role, and then the milk fat globule membrane for the dairy products also plays a role, right? That's why part of the reason why whole dairy products have a better effect on lipids and health than just the processed butter.
Just the butter.
Yeah.
The other thing really, I think, that they didn't explicitly mention here, but it's almost like it's very obvious in the omission in that they emphasize essential fatty acids. So for the viewer, some fatty acids such as omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids are essential for humans. But then the only oil they mention is the one liquid oil that is actually the lowest in the world. I'm almost certain in essential fatty acids. You're right. And that's a little bizarre. I'm a big fan of olive oil, and I also feel, if you want to meet your needs for omega-6 fatty acids by eating nuts and seeds regularly, that's similar to what I do. You don't have to eat soybean oil or corn oil. But I will say this, I actually reviewed the scientific background information on this section here. And I think a lot of effort went into trying to point out the limitations of research on saturated fatty acids and negative health effects of saturated fatty acids on the lipid profile, on atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Like, it really looks to me like, people, whoever wrote this, or even the people who are in the end responsible for crafting these guidelines, they basically put on a very, very critical hat when they reviewed the literature on saturated fats, the serum lipid profile, and cardiovascular disease. And they really were like, sticklers, and were like, this is a limitation and this is a limitation. And, I think you can do that. But I feel like then you also have to be sticklers in other areas. And I also read
wasn't consistent.
It wasn't consistent at all. They basically had a whole section where they talked about negative health effects of linoleic acid, so the most prominent omega-6 fatty acid, and why maybe it's not wise to consume a diet that's very rich in linoleic acid. Linoleic acid now is an essential fatty acid, but we need very little of it, or fairly little of it. In past dietary guidelines, vegetable oils or seed oils that are rich in linoleic acid, such as corn oil or soybean oil or cottonseed oil, have consistently been recommended because compared to oils or fats rich in saturated fats, they tend to lower LDL cholesterol and ApoB. And so here, there's, I think, implicit in the omission of including these types of seed or vegetable oils is the concern that linoleic acid could be having negative health consequences. And I do think there's some theoretically very plausible ideas here, that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids matters, that this affects potentially our susceptibility to inflammatory disease or to lipid peroxidation processes in the body. I've actually worked in this area for a long time. Now, when I read the actual expert, your colleague who wrote this part, I forget her name, she basically cited, I think, 4 really small little trials that found things like people who consume vegetables fried in linoleic acid-rich oil had increases in lipid peroxides in the chylomicrons. Now, that's really not evidence for anything. And so, again, as I said, if you have the stickler hat on and you're really like a very, anal scientist and you really want to find the limitations in everything, you shouldn't even cite this type of work. Like, I actually felt there were 2 different measuring sticks were used here to review that evidence. And it was very obvious in the omission of a large number of randomized control trials that really show, for example, no increase in biomarkers of inflammation in people who consume these vegetables or seed oils rich in omega-6 fatty acids. So I think to me, actually, this section I disagreed with the most. I also felt there was really an opportunity missed here to emphasize the food matrix aspect more. And I felt here this was driven to some degree more by dogma than by science.
Yeah, and maybe not even just dogma. Okay, so maybe dogma in terms of how the guidelines turned out, but maybe biases of the scientists. That's how I would describe it a bit more. I think it's a completely valid criticism, and you're probably spot on. I think that's totally fair. But yeah, I take your point totally.
All right, so the next one is focus on whole grains. Prioritize fiber-rich whole grains, significantly reduce the consumption of highly processed refined carbohydrates, such as white bread, ready-to-eat or packaged breakfast options, flour tortillas, and crackers, and whole grain serving totals 2 to 4 servings per day. And so I personally was really happy here with the pretty strong wording on eliminating grains in the form of refined grains and grains in highly processed or ultra processed foods. How about you?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is a really transformative change here. The first time I think that we've really gone hard. And if you look at the data, this is in the background report. I think grains in America, most of them are refined, right? It's something like 83 or 84%, something like that. So the vast majority of our grains, and there's so much marketing around this of multi-grain, even products that say whole grain. There's a really great illustration of this in the report. You can look at these nutrition facts panels and see the carb to fiber ratio gives it all away, right? You can have a whole lot of carbs with barely any fiber, but it says whole grain because the first ingredient is whole grain. Maybe it's 51% compared to refined, but then there's all these additives and there's added sugar and all sorts of ways that the food industry has done this. So I really like to see this. I think from the guidelines, you can see the potato lobby didn't really have much of an impact on the guidelines because they didn't get placed very prominently, which is not surprising. But they're kind of considered more as a vegetable in general in the guidelines, right? And because of our food system, for better or for worse, a lot of our starchy staples come from grains, right? So a reduction from 8 to 11 servings to 2 to 4, I think, is a huge win. Reduction where it's very strong language about reducing as much as possible the refined grains. That's super important. And one other thing that I think is often missing is on all the folks in the ultra processed food Nova camp that really love Nova, which, I like Nova. There's great things about it. It does not really do anything about refined grains, right? And that's a huge problem to me. So I think on this section, you'll actually get a lot of agreement between the low carb folks like, let's say, David Ludwig and Walter Willett, the plant-based folks, right? Because they're both in agreement, like we really should be reducing refined grains, and they've gotten a pass, and that needs to end. I'm hopeful. I really hope to see a change here. When I look at the school meals at my kids' school, it's just baffling how they can get away, like cinnamon rolls for breakfast, and they're called multi-grain, and Lucky Charms or whatnot. Like there's so many clever ways I think that the industry has sort of made products that are really not healthy for us that somehow can pass the guidelines. And so this really will hopefully put a hard line on that and make a big difference.
Yeah. I mean, as a German, so I grew up in Germany, and my mom worked in the bakery. And here it's really, really easy for anyone to just go into a bakery where you get actually, traditionally made, say, sourdough bread that's really whole grain. And in the United States, I think there's a real deficit there where a lot of times the only available bread in a supermarket is like the packaged factory made bread. And then it says whole grain, but if you really look at it, it's like, white flour. And then at some point there's like some whole grain, and that's really not what we would call whole grain bread. So maybe people want to pay some attention to that and really make sure if they want to get whole grain bread, for example, to really try to get bread that's largely whole grains. Like, I'd say at least 70-80% should be really whole grain flour. Or maybe even whole kernels. That's also a type of bread that we have here, which, for example, for glycemic response is by far the best.
Yeah, like in the US, we have this Ezekiel bread. It has sprouted grains and legumes in it. That's the bread I get for my kids. It's 100% whole grain and legume, right? Um, I wanted to address one important point that I just remembered, that many people, and if you look at the previous guidelines and food pattern modeling from the committee, they're just constantly saying we need to have refined grains with fortified nutrients because you can't get your nutrient needs met unless you have refined grains. I think that's just a really toxic message because it's basically just, pun intended, ingrained this notion that you can have unhealthy foods that keep making their way into the guidelines and in everyone's diets just because of the added nutrients that are added to them. And I think that's wrong. I think fortification is great, but we can also fortify whole foods. We can fortify whole grains. I'm sorry. And so we should be considering that when we look at nutrient gaps in the diet. You can fortify foods, including whole grain flours, as needed. So you want to add some. You won't need to add as much because not as much nutrient is lost. But I've seen a lot of concern around, well, how are women going to get their folate needs met to prevent neural tube defects? And I think that's a valid concern. That's a huge success of the U.S. of fortification. And again, it's not good to have excess folic acid. You hear that criticism as well. I think the ideal source is almost always whole foods, right? But to the extent that that's not always easy and feasible, it really is good to have a safety net of fortification. So let's just work on getting whole grains fortified. Hopefully, we don't need to add as much nutrients because we're eating healthier foods in general. But I just wanted to address that because I know a lot of people are talking about it.
Yeah. All right, to move on. So limit highly processed foods, or the way we mostly call them ultra-processed foods, added sugars and refined carbohydrates. So here it says avoid highly processed, packaged, prepared, ready to eat, or other foods that are salty or sweet, such as chips, cookies, and candy that have added sugars and sodium, salt. Instead, prioritize nutrient-dense foods and home-prepared meals. When dining out, choose nutrient-dense options. Limit foods and beverages that include artificial flavors, petroleum-based dyes, artificial preservatives, and low-calorie, non-nutritive sweeteners. Avoid sugar-sweetened beverages such as sodas, fruit drinks, and energy drinks. While no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is recommended or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet, one meal should contain no more than 10 grams of added sugars. And when selecting snack foods, added sugar limits should follow FDA healthy claim limits. For example, grain snacks like crackers should not exceed 5 grams of added sugar per 3/4 ounce of whole grain equivalent. And dairy snacks such as yogurt should not exceed 2.5 grams of added sugar per 2/3 of a cup equivalent. What do you think here?
I think this is one of the biggest wins from these new guidelines. So this is the first time that we're actually calling out specifically and strongly to limit highly processed foods. And if you look at the scientific background document, it actually specifies that the highly processed foods includes the NOVA 4 food groups, which is ultra processed foods, and NOVA 2, which is the processed food ingredients, right? And the intention there is to capture what you're kind of talking about, these added fats, right? The oils or butters that are just sort of free of any sort of food matrix and whatnot, and the added starches and flours, right? The refined. So the whole point there, I think, is really important. It's strong language. We have reductions also in added sugars by saying they're not no amount of added sugars is recommended. I think that's a good message. And then allowing up to 10 in a meal, that's a reduction from what was allowed before, right? Because up to 10% of calories were typically allowed before. And so that would be quite a bit less than that. So I think this is overall a big win. I know that the issue of how do you define unhealthy processed foods is still ongoing, but the FDA, USDA put out that call for comments on a definition. So that they're working on an updated recommendation. So I think without that being there, this is a really balanced approach. I mean, honestly, I think it's very clear we have 60% of calories from ultra-processed foods, most of which are unhealthy, not doing us a lot of benefits to our health. So I think this is a big win. What did you think?
Yeah, this actually directly relates to why I quit academia. And that is that I have probably put in 3 or 4 grants into the NIH in which I proposed to study a diet that was actually free of refined grains and added sugars, pointing out that in past iterations, there was always a heavy emphasis on grains, of which 50% could be refined grains. And I've always felt that's way too much refined grains, which is basically empty junk calories, right?
Mm-hmm.
That have a high impact on our blood sugar, that don't provide anything in terms of fiber or micronutrients, and then up to 10% of calories in the form of sugar, which I always felt is way too high. And so in all three cases, my grants were shut down by reviewers with the argument that my views were too extreme and that basically my work would have zero public health relevance because no one wants to eat this way. And I can tell you my entire group, I had postdocs, couple PhD students. They helped me all put these grants through. They read the feedback. None of them stayed in academia. We were all crushed after these reviews because we wanted to really figure out, okay, what's a really healthy way to eat? And in the context of a feeding trial or a clinical study, we felt it's good to study something that's a bit of on the strict end. And the fact that our colleagues in review felt that it would have zero public health relevance was really, we felt, unfortunate. And I'm hoping that something like this will start to turn the tide, that it will become more acceptable to actually eat a diet that's really healthy, where maybe the occasional dessert that's based on refined grains, or maybe a snack like a little something as a dessert that has some added sugars, becomes the occasional indulgence, which is the way I see it should be, right? As opposed to us constantly stuffing our face with refined grains and added sugars, and then being astonished that, we're all having overweight and chronic disease issues. So I'm very happy to see this. Also, I'm in the camp of feeling, yes, there are currently limitations with the definition of ultra-processed foods and the NOVA classification system. But I also feel that processing does add a dimension, and it shouldn't be considered by itself. Of course, it shouldn't. But one thing that we can certainly say for now is that some percentage of the ultra-processed foods that are currently in the market, specifically in countries like the United States or Australia or Mexico or, Western Europe, they are designed to be hyperpalatable. They are energy dense. They are soft. They're quick to eat, right? They're really, basically, they incorporate all of the characteristics that we know make us overeat calories and gain weight. And for that reason, I do think it's solid advice, right? At this point, at least. This may change in the future. If the nature of these highly processed foods changes, this advice may become moot, right? If we suddenly have more foods in the marketplace that are actually, designed to be yummy, but not like totally hijack our brain to keep eating, that are not as energy dense, but maybe instead include some fiber or protein, that are designed so you actually have to chew them as opposed to being able to almost swallow them without chewing. Like, in other words, if they're designed to have qualities that make it easier for us to not overeat, that this whole advice may change. But at this point, I do think it's good advice on the population level, and I am glad to see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And I think this is the last one I wanted to discuss: limit alcoholic beverages. Consume less alcohol for better overall health. People who should completely avoid alcohol include pregnant women, people who are recovering from alcohol use disorder or who are unable to control the amount they drink, and people taking medications or with medical conditions that can interact with alcohol. For those with a family history of alcoholism, be mindful of alcohol consumption and associated addictive behaviors.
This one got a lot of news attention. I don't know if you've seen that, but people are up in arms about it because of the language, because it didn't specifically specify a number of drinks. But I think I don't think there's anything really too wrong about this. Consume less alcohol for better overall health, right? And I think in general, the evidence suggests, for most people, less or none is the best, is optimal, right? But it's also, alcohol for the right person can be a really positive aspect of their social life, right? Or other aspects of well-being. So I think with all the qualifications here, I don't have any sort of issue with this general overview. What did you think?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I'm a little undecided on whether they should have decided an amount. Maybe specifically also emphasizing, how much more harmful alcohol can be for women at similar amounts than for men. Some evidence for this, right? That they apparently didn't at least put into this part. I'm not sure if it's elsewhere. So I'm a little undecided, but I mean, in general, I'm on board with the whole message, limit alcoholic beverages. I think maybe it could have been a little bit stronger or a little bit more concrete or specific.
Yeah, I think if one of the themes of this document is really that it's trying to be simple and not overly detailed, right? So I think that that's part of it. Just in general, what they were looking to do.
Yeah. All right. Did you want to add anything else, like as an overarching statement of what your view is of what's going on, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are a big step forward in the right direction, and they're not perfect. And I think there's valid criticisms that people have, and I think that's fair, and that there should be ongoing discussion, right? And I think just want to highlight that even in the report and the reviews, there is specific guidance about what we don't know and where we need more research and things like that. So I think that that's part of this, is that this is moving us. I think it's taken us a big step. I want to see continued advancement. And of course, I think if anyone had control over the specific document, they would do things differently. Like it's not going to be satisfactory to everybody, and that'll never happen. But overall, I'm pretty pleased with it, and it was an honor to be a part of the scientific review group.
Yeah, and thank you for doing this. So I feel the same way. There's a lot to like in this, specifically that limiting ultra-processed food or highly processed foods, refined grains, and added sugars is much more emphasized. I really like that. I, in general, like this whole focus on whole, unprocessed or minimally processed foods, with an emphasis on protein and also fiber-rich plant foods. I do think my enthusiasm is a little bit reduced by what I perceive as a inconsistent and somewhat dogmatic approach when it comes to the dietary fats and oils. And also the whole packaging. I think there's a lot more similarities in these recommendations with prior iterations of dietary guidelines than they make it seem. Like they make it seem like this is a totally new thing,
right?
Which really it isn't. I think there's some changes that are somewhat substantive, but I mean, there's certainly a lot of overlap as well. And I think they could have just been a little less, how should I say it?
Critical of the previous.
Yeah,
guidance.
I mean, yeah. I think so. So that's my view. But, I actually think it's very well possible for anyone to create a healthy diet plan with these guidelines. And, let's just hope that people will actually, look at them and try to adhere to them, because past dietary guidelines, that's been one problem, have not really been having a huge impact on individual food choices, I think it's fair to say, in the United States.
This is just the start, right? It's like the first step, but I think there's so much work to try to actually change what people eat. It's a huge battle. There is a big lever with procurement. So with school meals, with hospital meals, with military meals. And so I think that process can be good. I hope to see a lot of investment to support schools without kitchens to be able to do this, right? I want to see it rolled out in a really fair way. But I also think there's actually a lot of economic gain if these are implemented, right? Because our health burden could theoretically actually come down quite a bit, and that could save money. So I think that there is a lot of hope. There's been some announcements about different efforts to, emphasize, sort of encourage in SNAP dollars to encourage more minimally processed foods, right? And so giving some support. And there's a lot of, I think, ways to incentivize and do this. So hopefully we'll see a lot more policies that are supportive of this, and we keep heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that would actually be really lovely to see if now, the policy implementation also was consistent with this. In other words, for example,
Yeah.
if schools were given more money to actually make higher quality meals available to children, and as you say, SNAP benefit recipients, that the default is going to be that there's going to be much easier access to and more abundant access to high quality foods that are consistent with these guidelines. So yeah, let's hope for that. But for now, let me thank you for coming on. I think this was really wonderful to have your insights here and your feedback. And I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much, Ty.
My pleasure, Mario. And your insight and your balance and your nuance and your I think your critical eye is super important. So I'm really thankful that you're sort of digging into these and trying to be direct and honest about it, with the good, the bad, everything, right? So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, that was my conversation with Dr. Ty Beal about the newly released Dietary Guidelines for Americans. You can find a link to Ty's YouTube channel as well as the realfood.gov website with the Dietary Guideline documents in the description box below. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to respond. If you enjoyed this content, please consider leaving a like below and don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in evidence-based content about nutrition and the prevention of chronic disease. Finally, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their support. It is my goal to remain financially independent, and for that reason, I'm not engaging in any relationships with organizations in the food, supplement, or pharmaceutical industries. That means no sponsored videos, no affiliate links, and no other relationships, such as consulting or speaking engagements with anyone in these industries. If you appreciate that and would like to support an independent science content creator, you'll find a link to our Patreon page in the description box below. And thank you very much for considering. Take care.